Hi, welcome to today's webinar, and Sean is going to be presenting today about how to easily upgrade to Servoy NG Client. And this is a question that we've been getting a lot in the recent months, so we decided to dedicate a webinar to it, all about upgrading from older versions to NG. It seems sometimes like a tough task, but if you take the right steps, it's not that hard. Here today is Sean again, back from his travels to Europe. If you do have any questions, feel free to post them in the questions channel. We'll be monitoring that.
Okay, thanks, Jan. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Okay, yeah, today's webinar comes to us from our best practices series, which is kind of more popular amongst the tech webinars because that's when we respond to questions and comments and feedback that we've been getting. And something that we kind of hear perennially is, how about a webinar about upgrading to NG Client? So finally, we're listening to you and we're doing one. Also, I would point out that we get a lot of questions about this, and the first question I usually ask is, have you tried or have you even started? And what I find out is that people are afraid to try. So if we do nothing else today, getting over a little bit of that fear, then I think will be a success. Just a quick look at our agenda. Typically, I like to do mostly demos and very few slides. However, this is kind of a topic that requires, I think, some slides and some outlining of what you should do or steps you should take. So we will do a few demos of an example upgrade, but upgrading is not something that you can demo easily. So we'll talk a bit about strategies for conversion after that. So let's jump into our demo here. What I have here on my browser screen is an application that was built in the classic web client. This could also be the classic smart client because those two code bases are very similar, and you can build an application kind of pixel perfect between the two. But for today's purposes, I'll show you in the web client. And what we'd like to do is sort of say, well, what happens if we just try to upgrade this simple screen? And maybe I'll give you a bit of a tour of what's in here. We have a bit of business logic, so we can search for orders where there's coffee, maybe orders in Germany. You note that there's a bit of styling going on here, very rudimentary styling. You also might see that we have used the onRender event to highlight in red products which are discontinued. And we'll get to the reason why I chose that for an example, because onRender goes away in the NG client. Now, let's say we just wanted to go ahead and say, well, what happens if we run this application in the NG client? Well, I would like to go to the developer and find out. So I will launch NG client and figure out what we need to do. So you might see the application now in my browser. Functionally, it's actually pretty much the same, but from a style point of view, you can see that it's very different. None of the styles that I have created are carrying over to the NG client. And that is the number one big difference, and probably the most amount of sort of pixel pushing that you'll have to do is upgrading or translating your styling. To do this kind of one-to-one is actually not so hard. First of all, we have to move where the style is mapped, and then the second thing we have to do is change with the selectors. So I'll show you the difference here. In the classic web client and smart client, the styles are located in the resources project, and you can see I have an example style here, which was applied to the first solution that I showed you. Now, in the classic client offerings from Servoy, we don't use fully CSS. It's almost like a pre-processed thing that gets converted into styling in the smart client or the web client, and therefore we don't actually support the full CSS spec. So if you've long desired to do things in CSS that you can't do, when you upgrade to the NG client, you will be able to do those things. But let's go slowly. If we wanted to sort of migrate this style to the NG client, the first step that we would want to take is to create a style sheet in our media folder. And I've created one here called ngstyle.css. And the next thing we want to do is actually start to rename and refactor our style classes or our style selectors. There's a pretty simple convention for this. Most of the built-in style selectors from the classic clients, if you prefix them with .svy-, they'll be the same. So you can see form, tab panel, label, field, combo box, etc. And over here I have now .svy form, .svy tab panel, etc. Now because the prior version or engine of CSS that we provided was a subset of the full CSS spec, everything that you did have will work, plus a whole lot of new stuff. So none of your old CSS will break. Another thing that's worth pointing out is that in the NG client, you can apply multiple selectors to a single element. So whereas before you had to say, here's the style class that maps to this element, now we can say we want to map more than one style class. But if you just want to go one-to-one and go slowly, I recommend just kind of search and replace on those classes, and that'll get you a little bit farther. So the next thing we got to do is map that style sheet to the solution property style sheet. The solution property means nothing for the smart client and the web client, but this is how we map it in for the NG client. So I'll select it there, and why don't we go ahead and launch the NG client one more time and have a look. So now you can see it looks a lot more like the original solution. Here is the web client solution. Here's the NG client solution. The good thing about your Servoy application is that it's mostly forward compatible. That means all of the code that you write, with a few exceptions, will run the same. So for example, in our NG client here, I can search for coffee, I can search for Germany, and find orders of coffee in Germany. However, one thing here that's not working is that highlight that showed me that a certain product has been discontinued, whereas here you see it shows in red. That's because the onRender event is deprecated for the NG client. It's still supported in current versions of Smart and the web client, and it's not going away, but it doesn't make sense in the NG client because those things can all be done client side, not server side. And we do that with CSS. So one thing that you might want to change is to think about using a style class data provider, and I'll show you what that looks like in a example in just a moment. So obviously that was a very simple example, and it's sort of showing you a very bare bones kind of migration. There will be exceptions to what doesn't work, and I'll go through those in the slides. But if you want to just sort of jump in and get started and feel what it would be like, or see your application running the NG client, just doing that simple style sheet migration will get you part of the way there. Now, of course, the question is, why are you upgrading? And it's probably to take advantage of new features from the NG client. So what I always recommend to people is that start with the UX that you want and kind of work backwards from that. Don't try to just migrate everything and then see what you can do. So what I thought is let me show you the same sort of form and functionality with a different twist that is a UX first approach. So I created a very small example here called example NG solution. And I'm going to launch this in the NG client. And so what I've done here is I've taken a bit more liberty with CSS to enhance the style a bit. I also have replaced a few things with components. The grids that you saw in the list view down the side for navigating and the grid of the line items, which was a table view form, those are still supported in the NG client, as you saw when I sort of compared it one-to-one. However, they're not optimized for performance. Moreover, there are newer components that you get with the NG client that may be a bit more fit for purpose in terms of user experience. So here I have changed the the skin of the application, but not the code. So, for example, my search again for coffee in Germany gives the same result. And you can see now I have been able to recover my nice little highlighting of my discontinued product. So where the on-render event was deprecated, there are things to take its place, and I'll show you what I've done there. You'll also notice that the grids are slightly different here. I've elected to use a grid and not a list view. And this is one of the NG data grids, which can support things like grouping. So I could say I want to group these by customer, and a number of other features which are illustrated in other webinars, so I won't get into those. I also added a few extra tabs here, including some ship info that shows the order on a Google map. So these are the type of integrations that you can do very easily in the NG client that were very difficult in the classic web client or the smart client. So I just wanted to sort of throw that out there, that while you're doing this, you may want to rethink and redesign your UX, learn a bit about the NG client, and try to take advantage of what you can from the NG client. Let me show you a bit under the hood what was done in this solution. First, let's look at the web components. So, and I have this in the classic view, but when you're running an NG solution, you can also have this form in the HTML5 view, where you get more of a preview. So a couple of things. You may remember that I mentioned from CSS that multiple elements can be, multiple style classes can be supported. So for our banner here, if you look at the style class, you can see that I actually applied two, BG Dark and Banner, which were two style classes that I just made up this morning in this example. But those can be applied and removed simultaneously. The other thing to point out is that on our grid, which was in the order details form, I'm using a component here called the NG data grid. And you can see it's in my palette here that I've added to my solution. And one of the properties of the column is style class data provider. And this is a common approach anywhere where you want to sort of dynamically stylize something based on some data-driven artifact. So this is actually a calculation which returns a style class. In this case, if it's discontinued, it returns this style class that I created, product discontinued. And in my style sheet, I have a class there, a selector there that sort of tells it to be red, etc. So that's the reason I'm showing this very specific example is to show you the workaround for on render, which is one of the items that that is deprecated. Just some other things to point out here on the main form. Again, this is the NG grid, so this is one of the components, but you can see that there's a lot of components here that I've added, and you can add many more by launching the Web Package Manager. So if you're really new to the NG client, you haven't tried this at all, you can get components and services, which are like browser integrations as well from here. And there's these are being updated, and new ones are coming out all the time. So you always get the latest if you come here to the Package Manager. A bit more about that when we get to the slides. So I think that's about all I want to show for doing a sample upgrade. Again, a real project is, of course, more complicated, and there are more challenge areas. So let's walk through a few of those. So sort of an overview of how you would go about doing a conversion. I think the first step I just showed you, which is to convert style mappings. Again, you no longer use the style sheet in the resources project, but now you take it from the media. You want to migrate unsupported components, and I'll talk a bit about what those might be. You want to migrate unsupported code patterns. Like I said, most of your code and business logic is completely forward compatible. There are some patterns and some areas you want to watch out for. We'll talk about a couple other challenge areas, and we'll talk about kind of how to make a plan and approach this. So first of all, in the converting of the styling that I was able to demonstrate for you, you can see that in the classic client, it's in the resources project, and you sort of bind that at the form and the element level. In the NG client, you actually put it in the media folder, and you can bind a top-level style sheet to the solution. Some other things that I didn't mention or demonstrate is that you can include as many style sheets as you want, and we actually support the import in the style sheet. In fact, we push all this to the browser, so it's really the full spec as it would run in the browser. So you can include multiple style sheets. They can be nested in your media directory however you like. Remember that in the classic client, we're dealing with a limited subset of CSS. You can only do one class or selector per element, and you set that at design time. You can't really change it. In one thing I didn't show you, but in the NG client, you can dynamically add and remove a style class. It's just any element. You can do element dot my element, add style class, warning or something like that, or remove style class, and you can do that at runtime at your discretion. Also in the NG client, we're fully compatible with CSS3, so I highlight over here on the right some things that you would never work in the classic client, like having a border radius of 50%, which essentially gives you a circle, doing things like a box shadow, doing things like transitions. So let's say you like that nice when you hover over a button and maybe the box shadow gets a bit darker, maybe the background color gets a bit lighter, and then as you mouse out, it sort of fades away slowly, maybe 1/3 second there with the transition. All of those things you can now do in the NG client. So again, this is I consider this a challenge area because if you really want to take advantage of the NG client, currently you do need to do a bit of sort of learning on the CSS side to get the most out of it. We have another webinar dedicated to this whole topic, by the way. If you want to go back to our archives, we do go in deeper about just CSS in general. Again, if you want to do that one-to-one conversion, most things go .svy, and that's it. There's a couple ones that don't. For example, the table view of a form. Now there's a special selector called UI grid, and there's some different subclasses for that for odd, even, selected. That's all documented on our wiki, and I'll post a link at the end on a slide of useful links. Some things that will cause problems will be Java beans. So all the default elements, text boxes, type aheads, combo boxes, those sorts of things are supported by default, plus you get a bunch more of those components that I showed you in the web package manager. However, the old Java beans are not supported. But there's a growing list of web components that do replace them. So in many cases, you're getting a much better UX from what the replacement is, but you will have to refactor that. There's no automatic way for that. Again, I showed a table view and a list view in my classic example. There's also portals, which I didn't show. Those are supported in the NG client, and you saw that when I did that sort of one-to-one comparison. However, those are not optimized. There will be a bit of performance problem if you get a large table view, for example, with many columns on it. You start to get a performance degradation. And we have some much nicer replacement components for that, including the table component, which is for doing very fast, lightweight read-only, and that one performs extremely well. And then we have two robust grid components. One is for data operations, so you're able to read-write, and the other one is for analytic operations, so you can do grouping with summaries, etc. So there's also, again, these are covered in other webinars as well. So if you want to know more about grids, you can check our archives. You want to watch out for legacy code patterns. The one that I showed you as an example is that on-render event where we had the highlighted product. And most cases, there's a replacement for this. In the example I showed you, we just link a style class data provider on that one grid column to a calculation that tells us how it should be styled, and that's pretty easy to do. Some other areas that you'll want to watch out for is how you deal with code blocking. If you're coming out of the Smart Client, the good news is things work very similarly. If you're coming out of the Classic Web Client, it's a bit different. So things like modal dialogues or forms shown in modal dialogues, in the Smart Client, they were blocking, and so the behavior is consistent in the NG client. So the code that you've written will work as you have it if you come from the Smart Client. However, in the Classic Web Client, there's no blocking. So if you show a modal dialogue, then the next line of code after you show it is executed right away. And for that reason, most people don't have another line of code after they show dialogue, but they do things like callbacks where they pass in a function and then they call back to it. So although those patterns will still work, they're not really optimized anymore, and it's recommended that you kind of go through and identify those and refactor those. So looking for things where you show modal dialogues, we use the dialogues plugin, which wasn't supported. There was an open source module for that called the dialogues module. So you'll want to sort of deprecate that from your code base and replace it now with the dialogues plugin. Good news is that's all really easy to do. By the way, there's another webinar in our archives just about working with dialogues. It feels like we have a lot of webinars in our archives, huh, Jan? Starting to grow. We want to migrate any legacy integrations that you may have done some workarounds, especially in the web client, to try to get things integrated at the browser level. There was a web client utils plugin, which is widely used by web client developers, and that was a way to send things down to the browser to evaluate JavaScript in the browser, to have callbacks from the browser back to the server. Basically, that's what the NG client does for you automatically. So in short, you don't need it anymore, but you're going to have to find those places where you used it and figure out, what you're going to do. So maybe you made a Google Maps integration or something like that, and there's a component for it. If not, then it's a bit of a project. You have to figure out what tools are available for you. If you're coming from the Smart Client, you will lose access to the desktop. So if you were doing things like working with the local file system, printing to printers directly, doing COM access to Microsoft Word, barcode scanners, those sorts of things, a browser simply does not have access to the desktop. The good news is we have a project to solve this. It's called Servoy NG Desktop. There's more info available in another webinar for that. And this is an evolving project, so if you're really interested in this, then we urge you to work together with us to get the best result. One of the big changes is you have to move to war deployment. If you're unfamiliar with war deployment, it's a way of deploying an application that's not just deploying your solution to the installed Servoy app server, but it actually deploys the entire software stack. So the Apache Tomcat, all of your plugins, your environment configurations, etc., is all bundled into a web archive. That's why it's called WAR. And that can be deployed on any compliant web server like Tomcat or JBoss or any other one. So I would call that a challenge area, because that's an area where you've done it one way for many years and now you need to kind of move to a new way of doing. The good news is it's way more robust. You can export a WAR file directly from the IDE, just like you could a .servoy file. So from that point of view, it's quite easy. It does require that you have to administer your web server a bit yourself. So I consider that a challenge area where you have to learn a bit. Good news that there's lots of documentation and a webinar dedicated directly to this topic. So I've showed you sort of some simple demo of an upgrade, talked a bit about some of the patterns you have to watch out for, some of the challenge areas. To put it all together, one thing I would say is that if you have been thinking about an upgrade, the best thing you can do is just start today. Take your application, launch it in the NG client, see how it looks, go through some of the style mappings that I pointed out there, see if you can get it looking the way you want. But you may find out that it's not as scary as you thought, and once you get a taste of it, you probably will wonder how you ever why you ever waited so long in the classic client, because it's much better, and it's not really any harder than doing the web client. Another thing I would say is treat it like you would any project, which means you have to start with a business case. Why are you upgrading? Are you upgrading because your users want a better UX, or you're doing sales demos and there's a particular feature that you can't have, but if you upgrade, you can, and you can make a prototype and show it and win a new customer. So be business driven here in terms of why you're upgrading, and be UX driven. You'll get a much better result if you design your upgrade with the UX first approach. You saw that I showed 2 outcomes from that one order screen. I think the second one looked a lot nicer because I took a full survey of what's available and thought about my UX and came up with a different outcome. You really want to plan for those challenge areas that we talked about, especially things like the desktop integration, because that's really going to affect existing functionality. The other areas are a bit more of a refactor. You have to search for and kind of change them. But it's all something where you can just make a plan and you can go through step by step by step. If you look at it in that perspective, it becomes a lot easier to start to put into action. In terms of specific actions, I would say start with the CSS, because that's the #1 difference, and you'll see a big impact right away. It's also where your app can start to look and feel a lot better. Then go through, migrate the unsupported or unoptimized components, look for those code patterns, and start to establish your best practices for war deployment. So study up on that, watch the other webinar, look at the documentation. But finally, we understand that even though I've just told you that this is nothing to be afraid of and it's not as bad as you think, we do understand that you may need help simply because the risk involved, the effort involved is high, and you want it to go right. And that's why we are offering our Upsurance Program, which is meant to ensure the success of your upgrade. And this is a program that we can help design sort of your project, and you can work with Servoy's expert services to kind of guarantee that that your upgrade will be successful, that we sort of look together at what your current application does and what you want out of your new application, and what things you'll have to watch out for, what things will be easy, what will take a lot of effort. So contact my friend Jan if you want to start, and don't wait, don't put it off. With that, I will leave up these useful links, and I would note the first 3 or the first 2 are particularly useful. One is about just how to do CSS in the NG client. The other one is a sample gallery of components. If you haven't really dabbled in the NG client, it may help to know what's available. So you can go to demo.servoy.com and have a look at those. Jan, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. Well, I counted 7 references to the archives, Sean. I think that's the benefit of doing many of these, that at some point in time, we'll have a webinar where we can just list all the webinars and say, oh,
the meta webinar.
Yeah, you need CSS, go to this. You need this, go to that. You need this, yeah. We're getting closer and closer every day. Yeah, there's a question. Well, first of all, there's a comment of Richard. Very useful, Sean. And there is a comment from Stephen. Can you demo a bit of extended CSS? Like, how would you change the colors of grid rows?
Yeah, I can go in and show a bit about that. There is another webinar about sort of extended CSS. I don't think it touches specifically the grid rows. Again, I recommend that you don't migrate the table views one-to-one, but there is, in fact, I don't know if I showed this page. This styling the NG client. Here's the wiki page, and here you can see the grid rows have their own style class, UI grid row, selected, etc. So if you put this, and then there's even odd, I believe are up here. So even odd, and there's even a builder down here, this customizer. If you this is a third-party website, but you can actually go in. UI Grid is the library that's used by the legacy table list components. But you can actually go in and sort of play with all of the properties of the UI Grid, and it will generate the CSS that you need to that you can then paste back into your style sheet. But it's pretty much, if you just want to do even, odd, selected, you can do these items, and that will map directly to those table views.
Okay, excellent. That helps. There's a question from Matt. Can we deploy the NG Client WAR file into the Tomcat server that's bundled with the Servoy application server?
No, that's not recommended, and that's why I consider that a bit of a challenge area. You have to go and get your own standalone installation of Tomcat, and it has to be a version that supports WebSockets, so I think 7 or higher, 7 something or higher, supporting WebSockets, and then you can deploy to that. So you need to learn a little bit about installing and maintaining Tomcat. As I said, go check out the webinar in our, you can see here, Tech Series Home, this link, and you can see in our archives there's one all about WAR deployment that talks about how to sort of set up and administer Tomcat.
Okay. There's a question from Robert. I try to style, I'm not sure if it's a question actually. I try to style the NG Client DB tree view from Servoy Extra components. In Smart Clients, I use the selector DB tree view.
The selector, I don't know what the selector DB tree view, the DB tree view component will have, if you use the web component in the NG Client, it will have its own style sheet that you can override.
Okay.
And that will include a number of selectors, not just one. So if you it's a bit of work to get to see all of those. If you look directly at the source code for the component on GitHub, you can see the style sheet that gets included with that, or if you run it from source rather than from binary. But yeah, it's a bit of work to go in and sniff that stuff out for some of those components.
Okay. All right. Well, we're running out of time. If anybody has more questions, then feel free to post them in the forum. We are keeping an eye on it, so feel free to post any CSS or other migration questions right there. If you do need more extensive help, as Sean pointed out, then we can help you. So feel free to contact me to get more help. And for the next webinar, it looks like we're having a party, Sean.
Yeah, everyone's invited. Yeah, so 8.4 is long anticipated, and we should have a release candidate ready within 2 weeks. So we plan to do an 8.4 launch campaign, just like the other major releases that will probably involve more than one webinar. So we'll do one at the planned date, which is 2 weeks from today, but we may stick 1 or 2 around that webinar as well, and we'll be announcing that. So stay tuned and come learn about Servoy 8.4. If you're upgrading to NG Client, this is a great time because you get to go right to the next major version.
Cool. And it looks like maybe even number 50, the epic episode, will be on 8.4.
Yeah, we should do something special for number 50, huh?
We should, yeah. Maybe do the meta version about the archives of the archives.
I don't know if anyone will appreciate that, but you and me.
I think they will, because I was surprised to hear that we did webinars on certain topics that I didn't even remember.
You were in them, so.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and Sean for presenting. And we will post this recording very soon.